I guess maybe our first Ink 28 post was in September of 2013. It started to convert an Inquisitor, and all way back when Alexander Winberg, so like Echoes of Imperium, one of the founders of 28, way back when he was commenting on the blog
Wow, in
about that
Wow.
stuff.
2013?
Yeah.
Oh
So
my
which was the
gosh.
first year we started it. So and so like and that's the funny thing. Like we end up becoming friends with Alex and chatting through various means. And it was funny to like go back and look like, wow, like that was way back then. And I think similar, he would just comment on our blog and like we would do and others. And that at the time was a way to kind of connect with these disparate
Yeah.
people who had kind
Yeah,
of similar interests, which again is a lot easier now with Discord and
yeah,
Based
absolutely.
on
like that.
our first Ink 28 post on the blog, August 25th, 2013, Adam, you
Mm.
converted a Gorkamorka, I think it was a Gorkamorka Digga shaman
Yeah.
into
Yeah.
an Imperial Guardsman type dude.
That's
That
insane.
was the first
I need to go
model.
back. I need to go back and like
Yeah. So that
hit your
that
archives because
that
I bet there's
Diga
some cool stuff.
model that I converted was the first model where I tried to convert a smaller weapon, a smaller pistol. And by my standards today, the pistol was huge. But I remember taking one of the
Oh,
plastic
sick.
Chaos Cultist auto pistols and I trimmed it down to make it look more like a modern day firearm. Like I remember filing in like little grooves to make it look like the slide could move back and forth, adding sights and stuff. So that was my first foray into that, and I
Man, this
think
is
it
such a good
looks
model.
pretty good.
Yeah, it
But
looks great. I
I
mean, it's
did
definitely
not.
huge compared to what it was, of what you do
Yeah,
now. Yeah.
the biggest thing was I I started that process, and I feel over the years I've learned things and decided like, oh, that looked good, but I can make it even smaller.
Well, I
And
feel like like your more recent stuff, I can't unsee it. Like
okay.
I didn't even really have any sense that the guns were that much bigger or whatever because I don't know, I don't look at firearms that often. But then once I saw the
Yeah,
ones that you were making, I was like, oh, that is actually what a real gun looks like in somebody's hand. And then now I can't
yeah.
unsee how ridiculous all the guns look now. I feel like that is
Well,
just
so I
burned into my
know.
brain now
Yeah.
because of your guys' conversion work.
I was gonna say it for firearms related stuff. The three of us growing up, we did a bunch of target shooting. Our
Oh, cool.
father, he's a retired high school biology teacher, but now he teaches classes at a local firearms shop in Pennsylvania about how to safely and effectively shoot handguns.
Yeah.
So, like, we have been exposed to firearms for a while. And if you really look at the size of a lot of firearms in Warhammer 40,000, like a pistol, if you were to compare that to like the size of the torso of the person holding it, oftentimes the pistol is about the same size as the torso of the model. So, with that in mind, if you are trying to imagine that in your life, imagine holding something about the size of your torso and pretending that that is a handgun. Hey everybody, my name's Greg Wire. I'm one of three identical triplet brothers.
Yeah, hey, this is Eric Wire. I'm Greg's brother. He suggested. Adam, you here too?
Yeah, no, I'm here too. My name's Adam Wire, and yeah, I'm one of three of us who run the blog Between the Bolter and Me, and have since also started a podcast called Dragged into Turbolasers. And for the past, I guess, almost going on 11 years now, we've been sort of trying to share our hobby journey with essentially the world, and
We
have sort
certainly
of
didn't expect to be sharing it so much with the world, even though we did start putting it out on the internet. I don't know that we expected to have too much of a following. But I will say about the three of us being triplet brothers, I feel like that is interesting and that we've always had somebody to play miniature war games with. It's something that we have been interested in since we were
middle
maybe
school.
12 years old when we got the second edition Warhammer 40,000 box set with 20 Space Marines, 20 Space Orcs, and 40 identical Gretchen.
The card dreadnought. Don't forget the
Yeah, there was
cardboard dreadnought.
a
Yeah, that was sick.
cardboard stand-up dreadnought that we named Cardi.
I feel like one thing that you all do, both on the blog, but also in 28 Mag and on the podcast, both your podcast and the 28 Mag podcast, is some of that work where you're like documenting like part of like people's lives, but also like what people are thinking about, what people were up to in the scene. But I think it's interesting the way that like 28 is also so amorphous. Like
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
like in the music world, everything is so crystallized. Like you could basically like pick a band and you could find 40 bands that sound exactly like that one band and make a whole little universe around just listening to that one type of band. You could like invent a genre out of that band. But I feel like 28 Mag's like subject matter and just like the Inc. 28 scene and all the other sort of new spawning little universes around this side of the miniature hobby, I feel like still greatly benefit from that sort of like documentation and um,
Yeah.
like making sure that like people in the future can go back and say like, oh, the ammo bunker was a thing. There might be resources for me to like learn
Mm-hmm.
from in those spaces.
Also, another thing that was interesting that I don't really remember the exact time frames, but around when a lot of that was happening with the Amber Bunker and stuff like that, that was still maybe around the time when Games Workshop was only first starting to get into the habit of making plastic character
Hmm,
models.
interesting.
So the aspect of actually converting a model, most of the models people were working on and converting were either metal or they were converting them from some of the plastic like infantry models and such. And
Yeah.
so the first wave of plastic like hero models that were released, at least from what I recall, were ones that Brian Nelson had sculpted. Like there was the one Nurgle fantasy champion holding an axe over his like bloated belly. There was a dark elf sorceress. And so like there were only a few plastic character models at the time. So if you'd go and look on the ammo and a bunch of other things, you would see so many conversions focused around those models.
Mm,
Because a lot of these things were before Instagram and all that, and when blogs still mattered.
I think blogs still matter. I'm gonna go ahead and put that out there. I think blogs are actually the most important spaces, because the stuff that's on Instagram just goes into the feed and then it drifts away, and then
No,
nobody
yeah,
cares about it ever again.
that is very true, and I think it's a sad aspect of that.
Yeah.
Like, I think blogs still matter, but there are less and less of them, and they're not
Yeah.
tend to not be updated as much because in the like 11 plus years that we've done this blog, a lot of stuff, I guess, interestingly, has come and gone. The ammo bunker is now gone. A
Oh.
bunch of the blogs that had been doing stuff like this are also gone. Like Alexander Winberg had started Echoes of Imperium, which was documented a bunch of his Inc. 28 projects, such as Tor Megiddo and that big mech thing, Roth Secundus, or I forget exactly what it was.
Rostrum.
Yeah, that. I think it may have had a bit about his Outguard thing and Mordheim 2019, all that stuff. But that blog, he stopped updating it and he's taken it offline. And like even some of the initial founding stuff, Tim Malloy, his Tears of Istvan blog, which had documented some of the excellent initial, like the Yig games and some of that stuff. That's gone now.
I feel like
Niels,
people need to be, for stuff to like that to be preserved, like you need people actively engaged with preserving it.
yeah,
And I think it's similar to like the whole tradition of like libraries and archiving and stuff like that. You just need, like, stuff just deteriorates over time, you know, and you have to be kind of constantly engaged with preservation for something to
and I think
continue.
yeah, I think the Inc. 28 thing would benefit from some of that. And admittedly, 28 magazine has helped with that to some extent. A lot of those projects I've mentioned are documented in there. The initial issue had a bunch of, or at least a couple articles kind of defining what Inc. 28, Age of Sigmar 28 are by some of the important founding members that discuss it. But it's still very fragmented. And like our blog, and I guess the podcast to some extent, documents a bunch of it, but it's still spread throughout over 10 years of posts that are not that easily searchable. And it partially depends on what labels or keywords I tagged on the stuff over the years, which wasn't always that good. And so it's still there, but it can still be hard to find. And it would be cool to pool some of that stuff together. And admittedly, it's something that we've been talking with some people about, maybe even trying to do or work with. And I've started to pull together some information about timelines and what, to my knowledge, what are some of the important events that were involved in that. But it is kind of a big task, and
oh, totally, yeah. It could be like your whole hobby.
Yes, yeah. But I think it would be neat, and it is interesting now with things like Mordheim 2022 and some of those things, having like Eric's Hobby Workshop did like a video about it, and to see some of these things in quote unquote higher profile content, I guess. Yeah. And that has been interesting to see. And even just looking back at the stuff that we have done, like some of those posts, old 2013 posts, like, God, the photography is horrible. Like the lighting's terrible. And it's so that, and as I think we mentioned briefly, part of all of it had always been was just a way to document what we were doing. And it is kind of fun just in the sense of being a journal in a way. And usually in January every year, we write up a post kind of summarizing some of the major things we did that year. And every year I hem and haw about, do I really want to spend the time to write this? Like, it's kind of a lot of work. Does anyone care? But then I
definitely read the blog. I get it in my RSS feed.
Okay. But so I think back, like, you know what? if nothing more, it's something for me, and it's a nice way to think back and reflect. And so I think it's still useful.
Yeah,
But
even if it was just like for yourself.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and also I think starting the blog, another thing that we wanted it to be, one, to keep the three of us in contact with one another, but also to keep engaged with the hobby. It is by arbitrarily deciding we wanted to get approximately 4 posts on the blog a month, like we have forced ourselves to try to remain engaged so that we could keep doing that. And we are a lot more engaged than I ever expected we would have because of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah,
Every year all these last 11 years have maintained at least 4 a month. I
that's
am
amazing.
amazed that we did it or continue to do it. But yeah, because of that, as Greg said, it's a way, like, not all of are as exciting as others, but it's still, for all that time, we've still been, every month have been kind of engaged and thinking about the hobby, which has
Yeah,
been, is good. And that's like one of the things people always say, like, just paint 30 minutes every day or do 20 minutes of
Yeah.
hobby related stuff, and like you'll be amazed at what you can do. And I mean, it
yeah.
is true, like, to just
After a
continue to
whole
be
year, you can
engaged.
have painted 4 models. Hell yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah,
I
so I
mean,
don't know, it's interesting, and I'm glad now that we do have all this stuff documented, because, and that
It's
we
easy to
started a
forget stuff.
podcast, like it would have been difficult to keep all that stuff, like remember all that stuff and have like all those details. Like, yeah, now we have 560 blog posts. Whew.
Yeah, I mean, I think
that's
that
a
that is
lot.
just amazing, even just in terms of like having a process and sticking to the process, and like
I
I don't
feel
know,
I've
that's
become
such
a
a feat.
much better writer, or maybe
Yeah,
not much better, but I've become a better writer. I'm better at prioritizing stuff. Like it has had, I think, a meaningful
Yeah.
impact.
Also, one of the things that thinking about it as well, I think I'm glad we started recording podcasts and such. And I think particularly because of that, like I feel I would benefit from actually going back and listening to some of the earlier ones,
yeah,
because really the first Inc. 28 event we participated in was the Pilgrim event, and miraculously we actually have an episode of the podcast talking about that. And I think I don't remember what we said in it, but I bet there's a lot of cool information in there that I should listen to it again
I've
because
I've listened to it. So I think you like do such a good job of like telling the story of like what happened at the event, and like this is the one with like the child.
Yeah,
yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I feel like yeah, you all do such a good job of like like explaining something that when I first kind of heard it was like really alien to me because I'd only really played 2,000 point games with the people that I like
yeah,
got. Like I didn't really understand that there was like this other world, and I feel like the story y'all tell of like going to that event and like the narrative that had come out and just like the experience of like just hanging out and talking about your models and like it created this like utopia in my brain that I was just like, I need to find this in the world. Like, I need to like go and be a part of
yeah.
this happening somewhere.
Well, I think one of the other things about the community, we mentioned a little earlier that Alex had started commenting earlier, very early in our blog's journey.
Yeah.
And I remember that first Diga model that I converted with the smaller pistol and whatnot. I didn't paint it because I wasn't painting then, but then I eventually did end up painting the model and sending it to Alex for one of his, I think maybe
Awesome.
his first event. And then I remember
second.
his second event. Yeah, then I remember going back after he had received the model and looking at the old post, and like he actually commented on that model, and it's like,
Yeah.
wow. So
It,
yeah. So I think it's been a kind of a neat process seeing some of that and the notion. I think if you put yourself out there a little bit and try and
Yeah.
engage the community, I think that you can really get a lot out of it. And if other people see you willing to kind of engage, they'll be really willing to engage with you. And I think that's
Yeah.
honestly one of the big things I think we've learned about all of that with the course of the blog.
and I think that's also why we want to and keep doing it.
Yeah.
It's like it's fun to play some of these games, build and paint models, but
Yeah.
at least the most fun is being able to chat with people and like hang out with people and like hang out with yourself and talk with you about this sort of stuff. Like that human engagement is
Yeah.
amazing.
Absolutely. I feel like oftentimes I just like the word that I use is pretense. Like the hobby is a pretense for me to like get to know people and hang out with people. Like it's like I could really be doing any other thing. Like we could be cooking,
Yeah.
we could be like I don't know, pick any other hobby.
Foraging for mushrooms.
Foraging for mushrooms. Yeah, yeah. I have a bud that does that. Yeah. And yeah, it's just
Be
like a
talking
reason
about
to be together that like it gives us something to do while we chat or whatever. And yeah, the hobby oftentimes is that for me, like as well. It's just like I like the games and stuff. It's just yeah, oftentimes it's just to like be hanging out with people who I think are funny and fun. Yeah,
it is amazing how the hobby is broad enough that there are so many different aspects that you can get out of it and really enjoy the
yeah,
most. Like as you said, like I like playing the games, and I even like reading rules and kind of thinking about rule systems and such, but it doesn't, not to the point that I want to like break a rule system and like what's the best list
yeah,
and such. And I know a lot of people do that, and like
yeah,
that's very valuable to game design to try to
yeah,
make it better, to make a better player experience for more people. But like, man, that's not where I go. I like am more in my own imagination of what I think would be cool to help tell those narratives. Like, for example, like Trench Crusade, that like I guess a new game coming out
yeah,
that, and it like a playtest rule system has recently been released to people who backed the
I
first
haven't read it.
Kickstarter.
Yeah, I got
And
the
so
email
like,
that it's coming.
yeah, and so like
But
I read it and like it's fun to like think about the system. But and there's on a Discord a lot of people talking about balancing stuff and like, oh, like what about this list? And this is really overpowered and such. And like, wow, like
It
completely
didn't
went
take
over my
long.
head. Like just didn't even look at it. Like I
yeah,
read through it in like kind of like an editor sense, like wanting to make sure the language was as tight as
Clear.
possible such that it was clear and people could easily tackle it.
honestly, sometimes I feel like I do that for my like job, and I just don't want to do it
Yeah,
after
yeah, I
work.
hear that. But like, and to me, like it was immediate, like, hey, like this system seems fun. I like these concepts. Like I put together a list to try to play some games for our like Vastarian Inc. 28 thing, just because it seems like a fun system. But I didn't go to the point of like, well, how can I min max this list? It was more just like
Yeah,
what would fit what I find interesting. And yeah, I find it's a fascinating hobby and that there's so much breadth for
yeah. I really like that
enjoying
article
different
where you
games.
make the different stat lines for the different units. I feel like that does such a good job of like just saying, hey,
Yeah, and
like,
because that is an interesting thing, and I think it's something that is difficult to, and even we had come from, as we even mentioned earlier in this, that a big aspect of like we started just kind of the standard way, building small armies, painting like the box and so forth, but eventually kind of shifted away, and it can be difficult is obviously Games Workshop markets it to like build your 2,000 point armies,
Yeah.
do it like this and this so we can sell more products and so forth.
It's hard to
So
imagine
like it
another
can,
world is possible when you start
yeah, it
playing the
can be
hobby.
hard. Like, well, what do you do? And like, so there is always that tendency to like, well, what are the rules for this? How do I do this? And throughout the years, when for most of the stuff we've played in, we would try to have posts about like what our lists were and like kind of what the rules were used, at least to some extent, to try to show like, and this is how we kind of shaped some of those rules to fit more of our narrative ideas and so forth. And that's for
I just feel
our
like there's like a wave of games waiting to happen that are like narrative first games, and I feel like those just really they're like starting like they're hinting at it, but like if you look at like Forbidden Psalm and
mm-hmm,
like even like Rangers of Shadow Jeep, like those games are still essentially like skirmish games.
mm-hmm,
They're like games about like resolving a battle or
Mhm.
whatever. And I feel like there's going to be a wave of like games in the hobby that are like the mechanics are about telling a narrative in some way.
mm-hmm.
Like in the same way that that kind of happened in RPGs, where like
Mhm.
Apocalypse World and those games sort of came out, and where like mechanics in Apocalypse World are essentially like tropes in a story,
Yeah.
as opposed to like how to resolve simulating some action in the real world or whatever, which was
Well,
how
one
D&D
thing
Also,
that,
worked.
or I was going
Greg.
to say, one thing that I think I somewhat helped or learned from the Malifaux game was how just with an
Mm-hmm.
army list or like a stat card and little special rules for characters, you can tell a lot of an interesting story just
Yeah,
there. Like
yeah,
for each of the
absolutely.
Malifaux like gangs or groups, there were separate characters that had stat cards and they each had special little rules with like an interesting little name that gave you some information about the character and I think helped just tell a story there. And
Yeah,
that
Mm-hmm.
in turn at least made me realize that when we're designing rules for our gangs or our groups, we can do similar little things like that that I think, Eric, you
absolutely. Yeah,
were able to do with some of the Vastarian rules that you put up, or even with some of the stuff like you weren't even making new rules per se, you were just renaming existing
Yeah.
rules to fit with the models. And I
yeah,
think that helps tell a little bit of a story and a narrative just there.
absolutely. Yeah,
And it's fun. It's a fun, easy, and like particularly for Forbidden Psalm and those games, like they're kind of very focused around like you roll up and randomize a warband and like what's each character has a flaw, a
yeah,
feat, and like things of that nature. So it like tries to inject sort of narrative and interesting things. But like
yeah,
if you've already kind of have a narrative in your mind, you can just maybe do some of that, maybe change some stuff a little bit, change the name of something just to like try to better tell a story there. And the random nature might even help you develop new things for characters that you didn't necessarily hadn't thought of before. And like I think that's a fun process and it there's an opportunity for creativity there that I think is fun.
yeah. I also feel like people try to get to like they get like bogged down in the minutia of mechanics. I feel like sometimes I'll hear something like, "How do you stat a space marine for Necromunda?" And in my mind, I'm like, the stat line would just be like, if the space marine ends its turn within line of sight of your character dies. Pull it off the
One
board.
thing to add, and this is sort of you mentioning about like wondering how miniature games might shift over the years. And there has been kind of this fascinating shift in the 28 style games that are like fishing 28, apple
Yeah,
picking 28, and these um,
Mm-hmm.
kind of non combat
yeah,
games and kind of exploring this idea of like the idea of building miniatures and like putting them and rolling dice to tell stories like emerging narratives is like a fun thing, and it doesn't necessarily have to be killing people. And I think
Yeah, no.
that's
Yeah.
interesting, and it makes me think about how it'd be fun to like try to integrate different things like this to tell a story, like maybe integrating some like role playing sessions into like an Inc. 28 event, like leading up to an event to help get
Yeah,
people in a similar mindset and like the stories and rivalries that might be occurring before you play the 3 games on that day or whatnot. And
yeah,
that allows you to really get into that creative storytelling aspects without necessarily rolling dice or making models. And
yeah. I love
I don't
that.
know, I think that that's cool, and I'm interested to see as some of these ideas, these non-combat things, how they can continue to be incorporated in things. And because I don't know, the miniature building stuff is cool, and exploring some of like mythology and folklore and such is cool, and it doesn't have to involve killing. Similar to
Yeah,
even like H.P. Lovecraft and some of that weird fiction and such, a lot of it is so, at least to me, so impactful because it isn't like
yeah. It's not like a
gory
action
things. Like
thing. Yeah,
it's dealing with other more cerebral things, and I think that that's neat, and I am excited to see more and more of that maybe being incorporated over the years.
yeah. I would love to
Oh,
see more of that
yeah.
incorporated into any of the games. Absolutely.
Well, I
Um,
think, yeah. Well,
Do you do a
even
bunch of role playing game playing yourself, Trey?
yeah, I do a lot of role playing.
okay.
I like 2 games this week.
What's
Damn.
Cool.
what's set systems?
uh, I like running Trophy. That's probably what I'm going to run on Thursday.
Or tell me the name of that again.
Trophy.
Trophy?
I
I
don't
don't even
even know
know
that.
that.
It's like it's based off of this other system called Cthulhu Dark, and Cthulhu Dark is just like one. It's like a one roll system where the only move that you make in the game is you investigate, and essentially, when you try to investigate something, you roll, and you have a light, dark, and a dark dice. And if the dark dice is higher, you like kind of experience something horrible or something, and then it just has like a little like 4 up you succeed, less than 4 you
Mm.
succeed, but in like a lesser way. And then if you roll a 6, you kind of have dug too deep and you like
Yeah,
unlock
yeah.
the horror or whatever.
Yeah.
That
And
sounds
then Trophy is
amazing.
just like that with like a combat mechanic duct taped onto the side of it.
That sounds
I see.
amazing because, like, in I like the sort of simplicity of that,
Yeah,
and like it doesn't seem, or it sounds as though it's not like overburdened with lots of rules, but allows you to your imaginations to kind of take control and work with it. And I mean, because if you're completely honest about Games Workshop games, like, or the vast majority of them are kind of all the same. Like in general, you need to roll 4 to hit, a 4
yeah,
to
Mhm.
wound. Maybe they have an armor save. Like they
yeah,
can move 6 inches, something like that. Like they're all so similar. Like obviously there are slight variations. You can pre-measure, you can't pre-measure. Like, but all of them end up being are so similar, and I feel a lot of the like Inc. 28 events that we've been to, in a lot of cases, a lot of the people there, it's like, I don't remember how to play these games anymore. Like, well,
yeah,
just you need a 4, that's probably fine. Or like this, that's a harder shot, like maybe you need a 6 for that. Like, and in some senses, like almost is a little bit role played in a way,
yeah,
but in general, the rule system isn't something that I feel is holding anything back. It's there as like a partial vehicle to help you tell a story, but not like get in the way of it. Like, oh, get out that rule book to like
yeah,
see, can I jump off this ledge, or like,
yeah,
can you fall if this happens? Like, and I like that. I like
I hate watching
simpler
somebody look
systems.
up rules. I hate it.
Yeah.
I also
Agreed.
hate being the person. I never want to be the person that's like, well, that's not what the rule is.
Yeah.
I always want to just be like, yeah, that sounds great. Let's keep going. Like,
Yeah, I'm similar in that, and I like rule systems that are simple. And I mean, in some sense, I it's always a difficult balance though, because as Greg was mentioning about Malifaux and some of the stuff, like, and even like the new version of Necromunda, it's like incredibly bloated,
yeah,
but most of the special rules and stuff for the weapons aren't even very meaningful. The only
yeah,
thing that, like, to me is important, potentially important about them, at least from the way I like to play, is that it helps world. It's a world building thing. It helps build the world, and like to read
yeah,
those little things, it puts you better into that world and what's important, what's shitty, what's powerful. And I think that is neat.
I guess what
So
I like
I
is
think
when
it'll
that stuff
always
happens
be
at the table.
difficult.
I want it to like. I don't want it to be in the book. I want it to be
Yeah.
between me and my friends. Like, I feel like when it's in the book, then it's not part of what I'm doing or like part of
And
my playing.
I want to say a thing that may be somewhat controversial, but I feel of all of the games of Warhammer 40,000 I have played in my life, I have never had a cinematic experience. I have never had a game that I played that, wow, that cool emerging narrative came out of that, and I remember that always. I don't think I ever have.
Do you feel
And I
like that
feel
with the skirmish games too, or just 40K?
the skirmish games are a little bit better, but even with that, not that much. They are
Yeah. So
better,
I would
but
say,
even
Yeah.
still,
yeah.
like
Do you think there
I
is
don't
like
think
a way
any
to
of.
get to that, or
Well,
do
you
you
see,
feel like,
that's what I think has been would be interesting to probe at and get at,
yeah,
because I think perhaps, well, maybe we are the people that need to make this game, because I think
Also,
we have
yeah.
different
So,
ideas about what makes a compelling narrative, and
yeah.
you playing lots of different interesting RPGs, there's probably elements of those that could be incorporated in, because you like, from most of my gaming experience with tabletop gaming, where, oh, you move your model 6 inches, you roll dice to hit 4 and up, like, oh, this guy died, like, not memorable.
It's just
yeah,
Cool
doing
things come
rote
out of it.
things.
You move these guys, sometimes they die, not memorable experiences.
Well,
So,
yeah,
yeah.
I
I
think,
wanted to say,
yeah, Adam, you
for
just talk. You talk.
the the most in terms of adding narrative to games of all the events and stuff that I've been to, probably the Wrath of Hondius. That I feel did a nice job of incorporating some narrative elements, and I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that it was using a rule set based off of Forbidden Psalms. And really there was only one aspect of that rule set that invited this, and that was the notion that you would roll a d20 and you had the opportunity to roll a critical failure of a 1 or a critical success with a 20. And that, none of the other rules really mattered, but that one in itself, it could bring in cool narrative elements or just get you, like, you were trying to do a thing and you rolled a 1. That almost forced you into a mindset of, well, that didn't work at all. What
yeah,
happened? And the same thing with rolling a 20. And honestly, I played a Red Joy list in that where Eric and I converted and painted a small warband.
yeah,
I I did of all the, we played a bunch of games, I think 3 games. Going into the last game, I had one of the best records in terms of gaining victory points and all that other stuff. and like I did almost nothing in all of the games. Like I killed maybe one model,
Yeah.
but it was it was very thematic. Things that happened sort of made sense, and as you were playing and rolling the dice, some of those rolls, like you were sort of forced to come up with like, oh, this sort of makes sense with what my warband is trying to do. And
Yeah.
then particularly in the last game, that had I think some of the best and worst moments of the system, but I'll only really talk about the best moment. Um, and that was when one of the Inquisitors decided that shit was fucked and they needed to get out of there. And they were going to teleport away and rolled a natural one. And it's like, this is incredible. And so
Yeah, amazing.
we then, after the event, went back and sort of wrote a narrative battle report going through all of the battles and sort of weaving a narrative into it. And so that was one of the main things I remember about that game. And we wrote a few sentences and like added in kind of a backstory about what happened there. And
Yeah.
I think that one thing in that rule set really add or has the potential to add narrative. I mean, you wouldn't have to, but most of the time when someone sees you roll a 1 or a 20, it's like, damn. And then
Yeah.
that invites you to add something to it and build on to that.
Yeah, and like I don't know if they were using these, but like Forbidden Psalm had like weird shit that would happen when you'd roll. There was like critical failure tables and stuff in there because like when I played like the Dungeon Siege thing, the first round, like my first turn, I had a guy searching a building and he rolled a 1 and fell into a hole and died. And then my second turn, I had my wizard try to go in and like revive him, and he rolled a 1 and this demon came out of like this portal and ate him while he was trying to revive the other guy.
Oh god.
And I don't know if I'd call it like cinematic, but it was definitely memorable. It was
Mm-hmm.
like
And so, that's hilarious. But and I feel that touches on something that I think been thinking about a little as well for like Ink 28 style things. Like that stuff is funny and like is interesting and has the potential to be cinematic. But if you're building, like you spent maybe months leading up to some event building models, painting them, coming up with backstories, like having like a super unforgiving system like that isn't really fun. Like to have like all your guys just obliterated by dumb random bullshit, and then it's just like I can't afford to get new models. Like, and in a lot of cases, I think even at like the Wrath of Hondius thing, some of the like I lost half my warband. Like, what should I do? Well, just say they didn't die. Like,
I just played the rest of the game with like 1 or 2 models. I thought it was great. I didn't mind it. That just mean I had less to do. I didn't have to worry about.
I mean, yeah, so that is true. But like I don't know. I feel the more effort you put into creating models and narrative, I don't know if it's necessarily fun to have them easily get obliterated such that like you can't develop more stories with them.
So to that point, in the Rod of Hondius event, the leader of Lucretia, the leader of our like warband, they had a psychic power called Burn the Bodies, where with that, if there was a casualty, if they successfully cast that, all of the people who were down were just permanently dead. Like you couldn't get them back or anything. So it's like I read that, like, wow, this is really good. I'm just not going to use this. Maybe I'll use it in the very last game of the event. But to me, it's like this isn't fun. It's not going to improve
add much.
Yeah, I didn't think it was going to add much. Like I sort of liked the idea behind it, and it seemed kind of neat. But I decided I wouldn't even use it because
I'd kind of like to touch back on Greg talking about how like Games Workshop games like have never been cinematic and such. And like I agree with that.
I agree
I
too.
will say that all the Inc. 28 sort of stuff, the best ones to me have been ones that are very loose with those rules and like are looking for cinematic things like, hey, like I'd like to try to do this. How do you think we should do that? What do you think we should roll? Or like,
Yeah.
and playing with that to tell an interesting story, like they're to me they're a lot more fun and they are better and lend to making more cinematic things because they kind of fall back to a very core basic rule set that is fairly intuitive if you know the basic systems about like it's probably a 4+. If you're really strong, maybe it's a 3+. Like, and you don't have to look at stat lines. You can more just fluidly play with it and follow the dice and like, oh, what do you think this means? And that can make for more cinematic things.
Yeah.
But I don't think the rule system as a whole really facilitates that much.
I
You
mean,
have to be
how
there.
compelling is it? Like, all right, to tell a story, the way to tell this story is we want to do a thing. You have to roll this die. You have to be get kind of high, and then maybe you can do it.
Yeah.
I don't feel that's a compelling way to tell a story.
Well, and that also gets kind of back to like RPGs and such. And I think I've talked about this on maybe a stream or whatever, but there's a video game called Disco Elysium. It's like a role playing game and is amazing in that most of the time when you're like doing a role or whatnot to like, I don't know, be charismatic to somebody or whatever, like all the roles, success or fail, are interesting and
Yeah.
it pushes a story along and like there is very little combat in it, maybe no combat. Like I really appreciate like a system or a game that decides like we don't need this to tell the story we're telling. We don't need to include things just because it's tradition. Every story has to have, every RPG has to have a couple goblins to smash their heads in or something. And I like being flexible and creative in the decision process and thinking of how you can tell a story or make something like, but focused on like what's the story you want to tell and what could be fun and meaningful there, and not just relying on like, well, the only fun way to tell a story is shooting the fuck out of each other.
Well, so like for Vestarian, like, are you, when you all play, are you as approaching that, or like how?
So a lot of the stuff we've been playing now has been games between Adam and I, and a lot of it has been just trying out different rule systems to see how they fun, do they work in our mindset of stuff. But I think we do tend to be a bit flexible with the rules like we were talking about, because I don't think the rules ultimately matter that much. But ultimately, if we would hold anything or try to play some games, we will want to try to incorporate more of that, those sort of narrative elements without a huge sticking to particular rules, which is part of why we've always throughout the whole process have been said like, use a rule system if you want to play games in this, use a rule system you like and are familiar with, primarily because if you're very familiar with it, it's easier for you to take that step away from those rules and like just follow the games as they're going and do what you think would be fun or could lead to some interesting events.
Well, I think we're also still trying to decide if when we eventually try to have some events with this, what's the way that we can actually make these as story focused as possible and maybe tell a story that's a little bit beyond each person had a couple models and they moved forward a bunch and maybe somebody held this position and people were shooting and some people died, and then it was over.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. So in addition to experimenting with the different rule sets, we've also we've been experimenting with different scenarios and objectives to try and find, are any of these actually fun? Are they actually interesting? How
Spoiler:
long
virtually
are
no
these
Necromunda
taking?
missions fun,
That I think is
or at
what
least
we've
not the ones
come
we've
to.
played. They all boil
So
down to just like obliterate each other. Even if you have other objectives, in most cases, like the only way to really accomplish that is to obliterate each other.
yeah,
Yeah.
and
Well, let
so
me complain more
yeah,
about things not telling stories, but
let's
this will
go.
point towards role-playing games. So I haven't played a huge amount of Dungeons and Dragons, but I've played a whole bunch of one-shots, fifth edition, over the years, and it all sucked. It
Yeah.
was all every game boiled down to, all right, you're going on this adventure, you got into some combat, roll your d20. You rolled poorly. All right, you didn't do anything. Wait until it's your turn in the initiative order to roll again. If you roll poorly again, you didn't do anything. Wait until your turn in the order. But like, all right, now you rolled well. Okay. Roll your
Yeah.
d6. You did 3 damage. That's it. And there's a shit ton of rules in D&D, and none
Yeah.
of it fucking mattered because all what it was all right, initiative order, roll your d20.
Yeah.
Did you roll kind of high? You did it. Roll your damage.
Yeah.
Like shit's not fun.
Yeah.
And and I'm sure if you really got deep into the rules, you can have fun trying to max out a character or do interesting things, but at least in
Yeah.
the one shots, none of that stuff ever mattered.
Also, that's just
And
like fun you're having by yourself. It's like kind of like not the shared experience that
Mhm.
you're
correct.
getting at the table or whatever.
And so over the pandemic, I ran some Morkborg
Yeah.
sessions with my brothers and some other people. And like what I really liked about that was there aren't that many rules because hell, when
Yeah.
I played D&D, all those rules they had ultimately didn't matter.
Yeah. The rule is like roll over a 12 and
Yeah.
then if you roll a 20 or a 1, something wild happens.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, in the pandemic, we started to play that Cthulhu Dark game that I described earlier because it was so simple and we could play it over Zoom. And that was my first time in a long time playing an RPG and like having it kind of feel like a narrative happened. And another
Okay,
aspect of
yeah,
that game that was interesting was that like because you're basically going to die, you kind of like embrace it a little bit. You kind of like,
Mhm.
oh, how do I get closer to dying as fast as possible? And you kind of like you play to lose the game,
Mhm.
which I found to be like a pretty fun way to engage with a role playing system because like death wasn't so like I don't know what the word for it is. Like when you roll, when you have read a bunch of rules to get to where you roll a 3 damage and you kill somebody, like that's not interesting. But like
Mhm.
the ways that like the simpler rules enabled us to like
Mhm.
fill in the
yeah.
gaps more with our own stories instead of filling in the gaps with rules. Like
I think one other thing for a lot of the Ink 28 stuff, I think, well, yeah, maybe the rule sets that you end up using in the games, maybe they're not that inspiring or all that cinematic or whatever you want to say. For a lot of them, a lot of the narrative is before you even get there. It's
yeah
coming up with an interesting theme or an interesting setting where you encourage the participants to come up with ideas, come up with characters, with motivations, with
yeah
all of that. And then it is as simple as like, oh, you design this character, and it's like, oh, they have like a machine pistol or something, and like come up, however interested you are, you can come up with little interesting details and stuff that sort of fleshes that out, which maybe doesn't really matter in the terms of the game, but at least you as a player, you're fleshing out that world, how you interpret it, and what can happen there. So I feel that is often when you talk about playing narrative games, being 28 and stuff, I think a lot of it boils down to that and the people coming up with their own war bands, the setting, and loose narratives about why they're converging on whatever it is.
I think similarly, like the way that like it's both before and after the game, like it's sort of how like the recaps, you also fill in the gaps with the narrative stuff.
Correct. Yeah.
And like I think that's a really interesting process to create stories.
Yeah, hell, we try to make the stories cool when maybe they were only okay at the day of the event.
If you go and read the battle reports for the Rod of Hondius with Lucretia Bargest, I think we made it sound pretty interesting, and it really flows in a way that seemingly makes sense for the characters and their motivations. But if you were there watching the game, seeing me essentially just move across the table, collecting counters, shooting and missing a few times, like I wouldn't necessarily
maxing out all the dice on a orbital strike.
Cashing in all of your cards to just automatically pass the thing. Like, I'm doing something this game. I'm just using all my cards. And so maybe the games themselves weren't that interesting, but looking back on them, you could put a narrative to it, and ultimately I was pretty happy with it, and it flowed well. It made sense.
Having a narrative for your people or your models such that you are looking for ways that you can maybe tell a story.
You're in that headspace to do it. But I think also a lot of it, and this has been touched on, is that a lot of the thing I like the best is just that community aspect, hanging out with people, laughing with people, and having that shared fun experience together, even if you come with all this background and stuff you developed, and then it's just fun to be with people, push the stuff around and see what happens, even if it's not like a life-affirming game in terms of like so strategic. So like it's not like some grandmaster chess game where everyone like that's not the type of games these are. But just being with like-minded people trying to tell this narrative, and then even like the process of trying to compose some nice photographs, or like even
sometimes
stuff
like half the reason I'm there is just to take a nice photo or like have an aesthetic experience as opposed to like like competitive one.
Or even like yourself, like you've composing music to help for like Nemo last year, like that I think is so meaningful and amazing to help get people in a shared mindset or mood. And I think stuff like that adds a lot, and it's completely separate from
I feel like that's the sort of stuff that I am more interested in the hobby, because the games themselves maybe aren't all that compelling. Or at least not yet, but creating a story, setting a mood is a lot more interesting.
I mean, honestly, I think the more we've been in the 28 hobby and community, the more I've looked towards different ways to engage in the hobby that aren't just like playing the games, making the models. I've been trying to do like more artwork and stuff like that for different things, and I think a lot of that can really add a lot to like different things. And I think in general I would encourage people to again, engage in the hobby however you want, whether that is writing narrative, developing characters, composing music, artwork, all of that. I think it all has a place, and figuring out fun and interesting ways to incorporate that will make things
It adds to the immersion.